afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our Wednesday webinar. So lovely to be back. Today we are talking about relationships. The speaker is Dr. William Davies, Head of Applied Clinical Psychology at the APT, and I am Amy George, Deputy Director here at APT. Welcome, and as I say, so lovely for all of you to see you again, and welcome to those for the first time. So the speaker is Dr. William Davies. He is a consultant psychologist and head of applied clinical psychology at the APT. Post-qualification courses written by him have been studied by over 125,000 mental health professionals, meaning that his input has influenced interventions with literally millions of people. So it's all yours, Will.
Lovely, thanks Amy, and hello everybody. And I'm delighted to see so many people here for this session because it is such an important one, isn't it? I think when we're looking at our mental health, then if we get our biological factors right, like good sleep and so on, and then we get our relationships pretty much right, then we are sort of 75% of the way there, aren't we? We're 3/4 of the way there. With those two things done, it's marvelous. And of course, relationships, higher order factors like that apply right across the board. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about depression, anxiety, psychosis, relationships apply to everything. So let's have a look what we've got. The plan for the talk is 4 stages, 4 sections. First of all, how we know relationships are important. We know it just by common sense, don't we? But what else do we know? Secondly, factors from interpersonal psychotherapy, IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy. Then as an acronym I've been introduced to years ago, and I've used it for forever, SOS. And then I want to look at some detailed stuff about higher order factor and lower order factors, about simply how we interact with people, what works well and what doesn't. So let's have a look at the first section, which is how we know relationships are important. Well, from personal experience, we know that, don't we? We know when we've had arguments, had quarrels and so on, we are distressed. We know when we're having good relationships, we know we are pleased, we feel settled and well. NICE, which stands for, strangely, it stands for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. It's the UK body which is the defining body really about what we can and cannot use. They recommend interpersonal psychotherapy for severe depression, which is remarkable. They also recommend CBT, but they also recommend IPT for severe depression, for reasons we will have a look at in a minute. All to do with the National Institute for Mental Health study in the United States, classic study. Great to see people from the US here today, actually, by the way. So a classic study funded by the NIMH way back in 1989, but still has reverberations right now. And the Grant and Gluck study, Grant and Gluck, also known as the Harvard study, which has been going forever. So let's have a look at the first 2 speak for themselves, but let's have a look at the NIMH study. There's nothing going to come up on the slide, but it's so well known I can tell you about it. It was 1989, and it was across many fields of many centres of study. And what they did was they compared various interventions for depression, mild, moderate, and severe depression. CBT was one of the psychological interventions. Interpersonal psychotherapy was another, and they also compared it with drug therapies and placebo. So to cut a long story short, the only 2 things that were recommended that actually were effective for severe depression were the drug therapy and also interpersonal psychotherapy. Interestingly, CBT was not effective for severe depression at that stage. I think probably CBT has come along quite a lot since then, but that stage, 1989, it was IPT, which was the one psychological therapy that was effective for severe depression. And that was pretty much a shaker. It was a very, very good study, and it was very impressive, and that's what came out of it, interpersonal psychotherapy, looking at relationships. The last one was the Harvard study, often called the Grant and Gluck study. If you want to, there's loads and loads of literature about this all over the web. And the easiest way to find it is put in Grant and Gluck, because the names are distinctive. Grant and Gluck Harvard study. What they did was they followed people, it started way back in 1945 or 1950, around about then, and they simply followed a cohort, nearly all the people graduating from Harvard University. And they simply followed them through their lives. They took all sorts of measures, all manner of measures, height, weight, blood pressure, all sorts of things. And it made all these measures, and also psychological measures like how happy were they with their relationships, and so on. And then they just followed them and found, had a look what happened. And one of the people in the study became president of the United States, as JF Kennedy. He became president of the United States, obviously. Others, took their own lives and had terrible times. There's a whole range of things that happened to this group of people, and they're still taking this study for right to this current day. Robert Waldinger is the current director of the study, and he's the third or fourth director because it's going on for so long. So they retire or die and have to be replaced with new directors. It's a fantastic study. But this is what Robert Waldinger says currently. The clearest message that we get from this 75-year-old study is this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier. So that's astonishing, really, very, very interesting. Because there's all sorts of interesting findings, but one of the findings is that if you look at people when they're about 45, 50 years old, and you're trying to predict how old they're going to live to, the quality of their relationships is actually a better predictor than even physical factors like blood pressure and so on. So it's most extraordinary. It's difficult to believe, but it is actually true. One of the other things that came out of it was that quality versus quantity in terms of relationships. But of course, a lot of people, they go for quantity, don't they? If you look at pop stars and personalities and so on, they try to be loved by everybody. But even down to social media now, people on their Facebook posts want to get loads of likes and loads of followers and so on. They go for quantity. But it appears from the Grant and Gluck study that is not a very fruitful way of going forward. It is actually quality that counts. So, and in particular, the quality of your most intimate relationship. Your number one relationship, if that's a good one and you're happy with it and you're satisfied with it, that is the most important thing. So quality is more important than quantity, it would appear, by a long, long way. Okay, that's the end of the first section. So,
quick question, Will. Lisa's asked, is the Harvard study male heavy?
It is very male heavy, and there's good reason for that, of course, because when it started off, you only had male students. Nowadays, of course, it's mixed. It's male and female, and every gender is there. So, but it hasn't got that depth to it as far as the female section is concerned. Quite right, yeah.
Super.
Yeah. Right. So we've done the first section then, how we know relationships are important. So let's have a look at IPT factors next then. So the IPT factors are grief, role dispute, role transition, and interpersonal deficits. And to me, the major thing that interpersonal psychotherapy does is to identify those 4 areas as important areas to look at. It goes a lot further than that, of course. It says what to do under each of these 4 areas, but just identifying them is very, very important, because a lot of therapists and a lot of us for ourselves, if we're intervening on behalf of ourselves, are really, really good at problem solving. If we can see we can identify the area and see if there's a problem in that area, we can be very good at solving that problem. So problem solving is probably the predominant strategy, but let's have a look one by one at these 4 areas. First one is grief. And, I'm not sure there really is an answer to this one, is there? I mean, grief, when somebody, when a loved one leaves us, then it does leave a hole that needs filling. It's interestingly, though, that the person who's bereaved doesn't necessarily want it filled. They think that it would almost be disrespectful to the person who's left them, either by dying or by leaving them for somebody else, disrespectful to that person to fill it, some other way. But that is what needs to happen eventually. So time has to pass normally, and before the person will take any help we might offer them to fill that gap. It's very interesting, actually, because even when somebody who has been, so there are some deaths, for example, where the person who's bereaved will say, well, frankly, I'm quite pleased to see them go, for one reason or another. There's a variety of reasons why they might say that, but sometimes they will say that. But often, though, that is still the case, that it leaves a gap in their lives. So somebody who has been very awkward and difficult and so on, has been very demanding, when they've gone, there's still a big gap there. So the bereaved person still has a big gap to fill. So in due course, that's what has to happen. In the interim, though, sometimes, although as therapists, we really want to sort of sort everyone's problems out, and we want to minimize suffering and trying to eradicate suffering, sometimes that just isn't possible. When a person is grieving, they don't want to stop grieving. They are, it seems only right that they are bereaved and grieving, and they don't want anything different. Next one is role disputes. That's what IPT terms it, role disputes. We might term it arguments and feuds, things like that. They can be arguments with anybody. Arguments often take place at work with work colleagues, but it can also be at home with neighbors about the most, apparently trivial things, like people have lost their lives over the hedges between one person and the next. It's most extraordinary what happens in terms of arguments, and it can go on for ages and really destroy the person's quality of life for ages. So a role dispute like that, I think, is a prime candidate for problem solving. Very often the person in the dispute cannot solve the problem themselves. They're too embroiled in it to sort it out for themselves. But if we are their friend, relative, or therapist, then often we can help them do so. Firstly, by being empathic and validating and so forth, but ultimately by problem solving. These are not dramatic pauses, Ames. It's just while the slide rolls over.
I was finding it quite dramatic.
Role transition, I think, is one of the major contributions of IPT, to identify role transition as a very, very difficult, difficult thing for people. So let's just have a look at the role transitions that they identify. It can be all sorts. For example, it can be leaving school and becoming unemployed or employed, or going on to further education. But leaving school and going on to that next step is a big transition for a lot of people, and it's the first big transition that they may make. Becoming redundant or retired is another one. That's redundant can be quite early on, retired tends to be later on. Interestingly, the other way around can also be something of a puzzle for people. If they start off being unable to get a job, and then 2 or 3 years later eventually are able to get a job, that can be a real transition too. It can be quite a thing. Going from being single to being a long-term relationship, that's a very different sort of psychological status you go through. A lot of people have trouble with that. And the one that is interesting, I think, and vice versa, of course, long-term relationship to being single, but the one I find is very interesting is becoming a parent. And millions of people find this almost impossibly difficult. It's such a very big transition to being, to being sort of young and attractive and so on, to being becoming a parent, which is not to say that parents aren't attractive too, but it's very psychologically a different thing. And it's also a role which most people feel that you should be delighted to be. You're meant to be happy and delighted to be a parent. And yet you're so sleepless and you're so constrained and often so lonely if you're staying at home to look after the child, that there's a huge, huge transition to make, and does cause a lot of problems for a lot of people.
James has asked, what about immigrating?
Oh, absolutely, yes, yes. I mean, you get this on a small scale where people leave home to go to university, and perhaps a lot of us have seen people in that situation. But to go from leave home and go to a completely different country, of course, is absolutely massive, yes, where you don't really know what the rules are and so forth, yeah. Interesting. It's wonderful to have people from all over the world here this afternoon. I was just looking at where people come from. It's all over. And it'd be interesting to hear from people about the different customs and so on that take place, because I'm talking from the research I've seen and indeed from my own sort of personal background. So it'd be interesting to see. The last one in IPT is interpersonal deficits. That's an interesting one, really, because these deficits, so-called, are inferred because of the person's isolation. In other words, when we see a patient who's socially isolated, has very few social contacts, in interpersonal psychotherapy, that's normally put under the heading of interpersonal deficits. The inference being they must be have a deficit in some way, otherwise they wouldn't live such an isolated life. Who knows though? But we'll look more at the kind of interpersonal deficits and the reverse, interpersonal assets that a person can have in a later section. So, okay.
And Andrew's mentioned that you can even grieve for the potential of what might have been.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, the potential of what might have been. People who work with older people will talk about people grieve the loss of their looks, for example, and the loss of what might have been. That's right, because towards the end of your life, you know that never is going to happen then. In the early stage of your life, you're always optimistic if you're lucky. Okay, so how are we doing in our plan? We've done the first two sections. We're now on to SOS. You can tell because SOS is in big letters. We've done the first two, SOS in big letters. Then we got higher order factors and lower order factors. Let's have a look at SOS. And it's an interesting one because it's, oops, where are we? Here we are. Three key areas to look at. Now, this was an acronym which I was introduced to many years ago, and it stood me in really good stead. First one is intimate relationships. Second one is occupation, job, school, however you occupy yourself during the day, if you haven't got a job, and so on, the occupation. And social, friendships, relationships with neighbors, and so on. The first S, you can guess, stands for intimate relationships, the very closest relationship you have. So often it'll be a sexual one, but if you're working with adolescents, it usually isn't. It's the most intimate relationships there tend to be with the parents, with the adolescents' parents and with their siblings, but mainly their parents, actually. So those three areas are key. And of course,
Janet's asked what the SOS stands for. Is the relationship secretly an S?
Yeah, it's sex, occupation, social. But
Okay.
I don't really like to say the sex bit. It's better to term it intimate relationships, because it's not always a sexual relationship, but it is the closest relationship you have, really, plus occupation and social.
Yeah, fab.
I've grayed out story, where suggesting to me that you might want a story by this stage. And I can think of a story, actually. And this is a story around one of my daughters, and it sticks in my mind, even though it's a long, long time ago. it sticks in my mind because it was an occasion when one of my daughters took notice of what I said. So I can remember it clearly. And it was ages ago. And the daughter concerned was, I don't know, about 14 or 15 at the time. And she was in a terrible bad mood going over several days at home with me and my wife and so on. She was in a terrible mood, snapping and growling at us all the time and so forth. And in the end, I said, what on earth is the matter? She said, nothing. And I said, no, really, come on, what is the matter? And she said, well, words to the effect that she was having problems with her friendships at school. So where is that? That's occupation, isn't it? Her occupation was being at school. So she's having problems with that. And so, I kind of sympathized. But then I said, well, look, there's 3 areas, SOS. And if you're having problems in one area, like with your school friends, you need to pay special attention to friendships in another area. Friendships at home and outside of school, social friendships, as it were, outside of school. And the last thing you want to do is to allow it to spill over from one area into another. So you have problems in one area and that affects relationships in another area and maybe all 3 areas. And of course, that is kind of common sense. It's not a particularly clever thing to say, but it is common sense, and it does. But on the other hand, what my daughter was doing in that instance was a very common thing that people do. If you have problems in one area, it puts you in a bad mood, and that bad mood carries with you into other areas, which is very unfortunate, really, because it really wears people down across the piece. Okay, so that is the SOS. That's a good little acronym, I think, and we can apply it to ourselves, we can apply it to any patients we have, and so on.
What about relationships with animals or pets?
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. It's funny, the research on relationships with animals and pets isn't half as good. There is some, but it's not half as good as relationships with other people. But I mean, all of us know, don't we, that we can think of examples, I can think of examples, certainly, where people are literally closer to their pets than anything else. And I can remember a patient even who saying he's a 25-year-old guy, and he came in and I was doing my assessment with him. And I said, what have been the major traumas you've had? And he told me that his wife had left him the previous year. And I said, presumably the biggest trauma you've had is your wife leaving you, yeah? He said, no, absolutely not. No, my cat died last year. And I wondered whether he was sort of pulling my leg, whether he was joking with me, but no, he wasn't. I didn't laugh, fortunately, but he wasn't joking at all. And that had been a bigger trauma for him than his wife leaving him. But we've all got stories like that, I guess. So the power that dogs and cats and other pets indeed have over people is amazing.
And what about the relationship with yourself that you have, for example, empathy and compassion?
With yourself, fantastic. Well, of course, that is the stuff of compassion-focused therapy, and it really pervades everything, the relationship you have with yourself. That's Paul Gilbert, compassion-focused therapy, and he taught, and empathy and warmth you have towards yourself. And that is an area really worth getting into. It is fantastic, because what he demonstrates is that if you don't have that kind of warmth and empathy towards yourself, nothing else works very well. For example, you can apply cognitive therapy, all the best instructions to yourself. If you don't do them with compassion, they don't work. So yeah, well spotted.
And Pamela's agreeing she loved her dog, but not her husband.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like a good dog, Pamela.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, good.
Okay, so here's our 4 sections. We've done the first 3, and if you're hoping we're cruising to a halt, I'm afraid higher order factors and lower order factors have got quite a lot of stuff in there. So let's just have a look. Higher order.
Does the picture of the bridge have any relevance? Or?
No, not at all. No. It's just
Just a nice bridge. Okay.
it's just a nice bridge. And I always feel people in California are very into relationships. They talk about relationships a lot and so on, and they're quite tuned into that kind of thing. And they've had tea groups from way back. They introduced tea groups which looked at relationships and so forth. So let's have a look at some of the higher order factors. One is, they say it quite a lot these days. It actually first came, I think, from Nietzsche. Be yourself because everybody else is already taken. And that's a super one because as one of your contributors, Amy, was just saying a moment ago, what about empathy, warmth, and genuineness? This one is genuineness. And we all know if you're talking to somebody and you feel as though they're putting on an act or a front and they're not really themselves, you think, well, this is a complete waste of time. We're not really talking to anybody. We're just talking to someone who's putting on an act. So we have to be ourselves. That's the only way forward. And the great thing is that everybody has other people who will take to them. If you are yourself, some other people will actually respond to that. It's a difficult one to accept unless you actually try it out. Second one is a question of feeling sort of deep down good towards other people. As you will know, there are different divisions of the brain. There's the cerebral cortex, where you can work out what would be the best things to say and the best things to do. If you want to be liked by other people, what would be good things to say and good things to do. But there's also the limbic system, which is the emotional center. It goes much, much further back in time than the cerebral cortex in our evolution. And that is where we can feel deep down good towards other people, have just a warm attitude. Again, it's your warmth coming out, but just feel good towards other people. It's the part of the brain that actors try and access when they're trying to do method acting. They actually feel in the part of that person, and they allow all the stuff to come out, rather than working on the particular tone of voice, particular mannerisms, and so on. They just feel the part, and then allow the mannerisms and tone of voice to flow after that. I think the question of finding an environment or a social environment and other people to suit your personality is fantastic. The modern idiom at the moment is that most society things are geared towards extroverts. You know, if you go on courses, say get into small groups and discuss this and come into your conclusions and so on. The ability to sit quietly by yourself and think about it is very rare. So introverts get a bit of a raw deal at the moment, and you find introverts, unhelpfully, I think, for themselves. It doesn't work well for them, I don't think, trying to be extrovert and thinking they shouldn't be introvert, they should be something else. Absolutely not. There's half the population is introvert and half's extrovert, and everyone's perfectly legitimate. So to find an environment to suit your personality is really, really important, I think. Other people who you fit in with. What do they say? There's a nice saying, I'm just trying to remember it. It's no use a tulip trying to be a rose just because it's been planted in a rose garden. It can only be a tulip. And finally, I think on this section is mix with people who have a good effect on you. Now that's the idea of people who are having a good effect, I think, is a very strong one. And I think if you think of yourself and you think, well, who has a good effect on me? You might even like to jot it down, who has a good effect on you. It might be just one or two or three or four people. But to spend time with people who have a good effect on you and minimize the time with people who have a not so good effect on you is a really great thing to do. It's a really strong thing to do. Rather than working on yourself and trying to make yourself a better person and so on, it's usually better for everyone to be themselves and to mix with people who have a good effect on them. Okay. Now,
what's the ocean bit for?
that was just That's personality characteristics, actually, on your personality. When people do, there's all sorts of personality tests. So there's all sorts of personality factors, 15, 16, 17 more personality factors, but there's 5 that come up again and again. And I'm anxious now whether I can remember them. It's O is for openness, open to new ideas and new experiences. Some people are very open to new ideas, other people are not. C is for conscientiousness. You can't teach people to be conscientious. If they're not conscientious, that's a stable personality trait, and it's difficult to teach them to be conscientious. And it's no less worthy than being conscientious. Extrovert is, E is for extrovert and introvert, so that dimension. A is for agreeable, funnily enough. And some people just seem to be intrinsically more agreeable than other people. That's a dimension. So you be up the agreeable end or down the disagreeable end. And N is for neuroticism versus stability. Some people just are very stable people. They just don't get swayed very much. Other people are very, they do get swayed a lot by things that go on and so on. So to find an environment that suits whichever is your personality type is really good.
Fran makes the point that it's not very easy to minimize time with people who have a bad effect on you if you're a therapist. Certainly it makes it even more important to spend time outside of work with people who have a good effect on you.
Yes. Well, I suppose all depending. I mean, there's a lot of therapists do actually enjoy spending time with their patients. So all depending perhaps. But here we are. You can plot the impact that different people have on you. Here's a little a map here. This was a real person, and what they found was this is an easy diagram to do for yourself. All you have to do is do 1, 2, 3 circles, and yourself in the middle. And this person, the person she had the most impact on them was their sister. Second most big impact was partner. Third most big impact was one of their colleagues. Fourth most big was an old school friend. Fifth most big was mother. And those were the main relationships. And they plotted out in terms of how much time was spent thinking about them mainly, the kind of impact in that way. The next thing was to put numbers on. So were these positive impacts or negative impacts? And fascinatingly, the person with the biggest impact was the sister, as we said, but their impact was a negative one, and quite a strong negative one. And so that's a very big impact for the person. Their partner had a kind of mildly positive effect, +1 over here. The colleague had a strong negative effect, and they spent quite a lot of time thinking about this colleague. And finally, this old school friend had a strong positive effect and was there. So it's a really interesting map. And when you plot it out like that for a person, it is fascinating to see what you might do. You might say, well, the first thing we need to do is sort out this the relationship with the sister and a colleague, perhaps. Other people looking at that might say, well, they might have a different view. Might say there's other things you could do, but to me, that's a couple of the things you might first of all tackle. Okay.
What's the effect that you were looking at when you were thinking of them or when you were spending time with them, or does it matter?
Just the overall, like if you said to me, overall, what effect does your old school friend have on you? I'd say, oh, strong positive. When I'm thinking of them, they're generally an asset to my life. Whether I'm thinking about them or not, I'm really pleased to have them in my life. A strong positive effect.
What about if you were thinking about people who have passed away? Could they go on the map?
Yes, they can. Absolutely, they can. And sometimes we'll spend time talking about that person who has passed away, and sometimes it's sometimes people are very thinking about them has a very sad effect for them. Other times, it can be a very nostalgic effect when they think, those are the days, we're never going to have days like that again. And other times, it can come to be a happy memory, even though the person is gone, pure joy of remembering the good times that were had. And it can transcend from one to the other.
Super.
Let's have a look at lower order factors then, sort of the nitty gritty, you might say, real small pieces of advice, divided into 3 sections, mainly for adolescents, mainly for adults, and mainly in intimate relationships. First of all, with adolescents, don't try to make anybody else envious of what you do. Now, of course, there's a whole industry, really, the Facebook, etc., whereby people do try to make other people envious of what they do. They also do other great things on there as well. It's not entirely dedicated to making people envious, but some people really do try and make other people envious of what they do. It's not a good strategy for making friends. The hypothesis is that people will kind of admire you and want to be with you and be your friend. Doesn't normally have that effect, makes people envious and bitter about you and not want to be your friend. Number 2 is don't criticize your friends in their absence, or really criticize anybody, because obviously your friends actually think, well, I'm not sure I want to be this person's friend, because what they do is they go around criticizing their friends. So all I've gained by being this person's friend is to have someone who's going around criticizing me. So as a simple rule, don't criticize your friends in their absence, or criticize anybody really, because it worries people. And the third one is don't boast about your other friends to your friends. And that is, it's a strange, because some people kind of are very boastful about the great friends they have and the great times they have with their other friends, happily boast about that to the friend they're talking to at the moment. So I think those are particularly for adolescents, but they're very strong things and they have a big effect. And I think it's certain things that adolescents could do with kind of knowing, because it's so commonplace, those errors to make. Sometimes it almost seems universal that all adolescents do these things. Sometimes it seems to be like that sometimes. But there we go. For adults, there's, here we are, just like you had earlier, Ames, the empathy, warmth, and genuineness. Now, these, of course, were Rogerian factors. Carl Rogers, at one stage, voted the most influential psychologist in the world, ahead of Freud. And his factors are empathy, warmth, genuineness, and unconditional positive regard. So empathy, warmth, and genuineness certainly for strong ones, aren't they? Empathy is interesting because it's how do we express empathy? And there's lots of ways. The simplest way is when you're listening to somebody, and this is so simple that it seems almost bad with its simplicity, is to repeat the last 3 words they say. So if I've just said that to you, you might say, the last 3 words. I say, yes, the last 3 words, because it really makes an impact. And it just sets the person going again. And it's uncanny how effective that can be, just repeating the last 3 words, really strange. The next most simple way of expressing empathy is to paraphrase the whole utterance that the person said. So you might say, if you're listening to me, you might say, well, so you're saying that empathy, warmth, and genuineness are 3 really important characteristics, and empathy can be expressed quite simply. Yeah, exactly. And I'm thrilled to bits because, you've listened to what I've said and so on. And that's, and finally, though, the biggest level of empathy is it's almost like the theory of mind, where you can actually understand where the other person is coming from. You totally understand where they're coming from. You totally see their point of view and can normally almost anticipate their point of view before they've even spoken. Warmth is an interesting one because very rarely does anyone get criticized for being too warm. people worry about being too warm in case they are misinterpreted. And we're not talking about, sexual type relationships or where you want a sexual relationship with other people, just ordinary warmth in personality terms and personal terms to other people, just friendly and warm. Very rarely do people get criticized for being too friendly and warm. And genuineness we mentioned earlier on, unless you're genuine, you're really not kind of in the game. Nice, isn't it, if you're talking to someone to when they ask you questions, show an interest in you by asking questions. Rich questions are where you really sort of add a lot of detail to the question. Like I have a friend who, he and I are interested in cars, and he asked me once. He said, no, it wasn't very long ago, but he asked me once. He said, Will, if you were to have a car, to buy a new car, and you wanted a car that kind of expressed your personality, but was also perfectly good to use for everyday work purposes, where you go to, to see your work colleagues and so on. So it doesn't probably need to be a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or whatever. It needs to be a kind of almost an ordinary car or an everyday car, but it expresses your personality and you'd really enjoy driving it. What would it be? Now that is a rich question. It's basically, rephrasing the old question of, what car would you have next? Which is kind of a boring question. But by richifying it like that, adding context and detail, it makes it much more interesting. Another one, if you're asked a question, reply properly and eventually ask the same question back. Now, at its most simple, it is, if someone says, how are you? Well, you're quite entitled to say, well, I'm so-so. This week has been, this and that. We've had some ups and downs in it, and particularly the best up was whatever it is and so on. And it might be, somewhat more than they bargained for, but it's still good. And when you've finished all that, you can say, and how about you? How are you? And that can be quite sort of shocking for people if they're not used to it, but it's perfectly legitimate in the right context, obviously, And that's the way good conversations go. One person asks a question, the other person gives a full answer, and then kind of asks it back again to the first person. Because the first person has normally asked a question they want you to ask them.
And what are your thoughts on self-disclosure?
Well, in interpersonal relationships, it's absolutely appropriate, isn't it? But only to a degree that matches your relationship. So if we're talking to our partners, then we self-disclose pretty much about anything we want to, But if I'm talking to a brand new colleague at work and I started self-disclosing left, right, and centre, that'd be inappropriate, wouldn't it? I might self-disclose that I have, a short journey to work. That would be kind of appropriate, wouldn't it? It's matching the level of the relationship. But yes, it has to match where you're coming from, the nature of the relationship. Okay, what about in intimate relationships, which we know from the Grant and Gluck study are extremely important? Now, there's a horrible phrase that goes about, but it's a useful phrase. It is actually called market value, in that if you look at people of whatever gender, it's gender irrespective, people of equal or roughly equal market value pair off with each other. So that is something that happens, and it's when people I know somebody who is quite old now. He's not quite a contemporary of mine, but he's getting on that way, and he's never had a very good judgment on his market value, and as a result, he's never found a partner, never. And it's a great shame because, as far as I know, there's no research that says that the greater your market value, the happier you are. Not at all, no. There's plenty of research that says the better the relationships you have, the happier you are. But people with a high market value are not necessarily happier than with a low market value, interestingly. So it's just a question of finding somebody that you match with very nicely. Interesting that sometimes, and this is again, it's quite a harsh saying, but it's quite a good one. It's this: if the grass always seems to be greener on the other side of the fence, maybe you're not looking after your own patch well enough. And that is said to people about the nature of their relationships. Sometimes people are in a long-term relationship and they're looking around themselves and seeing other people who always seem to be, having a better relationship, and looking at other people thinking maybe they should get together with them rather than their current partner, and so on. And that can be absolutely correct. It can be, a good path to go down. On the other hand, it's also worth looking about the grass is always greener question. And I don't know whether you remember Friends, wasn't it, with Chandler's mum. You know what she said to Chandler, trying to put her son right? She said, don't go looking for the perfect woman, because even if you find her, she might be looking for the perfect man. In other words, not Chandler. So it's kind of, again, quite harsh, but these things are sort of all true, unfortunately.
And just to keep you on your toes, how would you define someone's market value?
Oh, it's extraordinary, actually. People have a very good sense of their market value, and so does everybody else. Experiments been done on it, and it's not difficult to judge from appearance. Just from sheer appearance, people can judge each other's market value, and it goes across cultures too. It's not just, it goes across races and so on. It's fascinating, actually. It's everyone can make a pretty good shot at what the other person's market value is. Some people modify their market value. It's mainly by appearance, but some people modify it by having loads of money or fantastic personalities or whatever it would be. So a quote that I came across the other day: intimacy is repeatedly being responded to. And it is interesting, isn't it, when you listen to other couples' conversations, sometimes one person will say something, the other person doesn't say anything. Or one person will say something, and the other person starts talking halfway through. And it is just remarkable. Whereas, sorry to tell stories about my grandchildren, but they are remarkably good at this. If you're talking to either one of my two grandchildren, you say something to them, then there's a pause. They don't say anything, but they're processing what has just been said, and then they respond to it with a really good response, typically. I think, wow, how do they do that at age 9 and 11 or whatever they are, and that's it's almost like a model to try and keep that into adulthood, because it makes you feel very good when they listen to what you say and come out with a good response. It's amazing. And there's just a small one, but in intimate relationships, this is incredibly important, isn't it? I cannot understand it when you see people after 20 years still arguing about who's going to put the bins out. That just beats me. And it's such a small thing, and it's got such a big role in their life. How can that be that after 20 years they're still arguing about it, and it's still such a big thing? Now, it doesn't matter which of these areas you look at, there's lots and lots of advice. Now, I'd be interested in a minute, Ames, about what people come up with, because there's such good tips that people will have, I'll bet. Just one final thing. This is the last slide. Because we talk about thoughts and CBT and so on, and relationship quality, and of course they interact. And the quality of our relationships, whether it's positive or negative, will influence the thoughts about the relationship. So, but equally though, our thoughts about the relationship will influence the quality of the relationship. So you can start with either side. So if you have positive thoughts about the relationship, that will, to a degree, influence the quality of the relationship, just as the quality of the relationship will influence the thoughts about the relationship. But having said that, there's some people who are really just not suited to each other, and it doesn't matter what you do. You think as positively as you like, and I've had one person who I saw, and he said, the problem is simple. He said, I just want to feel the same way about my wife as I do about my mistress. And I said, well, did you never feel the same way about your wife as you do about your mistress? He said, no, never, never. And of course, it was an impossible task because that's not the kind of area of the brain you can work on very easily. So it wasn't a possible task. But sometimes it's a great shame because you can see people who are suited and they just haven't sort of adjusted themselves. So I'm going to stop talking because I bet there's other people with great ideas. So there we are. Thank you.
No, there's I think everyone's been absorbed, and the concept of market value is causing a bit of discussion.
I bet, yes. It's not a nice concept.
No. But Deborah might help a few relationships, telling us that a study has shown that taking the bins out takes less than 3 minutes. So there's no need to argue.
That's not the point, they say. That's not the point. It's the principle of the thing.
Yeah. So no, the comments are pouring in, so just trying to keep up.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just carry on for a minute.
Okay, so no, that is, so just on the summary slide, just so there we are. There were 4 sections. The how we know relationships are important, the IPT factors of grief, etc., the SOS factors, intimate relationships, occupation, and social, and then the higher order and lower order factors we've just been looking at. So that's all I have to say.
And David's mentioned that you need to help a couple who have the 2 opposites. So one thinks about the quality of the relationship and the other has the thoughts about the quality. So one's thinking about if you have people in the couple that are opposite sides of your diagram.
Yeah.
One might be thinking about the quality and one might be having the thoughts about the relationship.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Opposing views.
Yes.
Sorry, Karen.
I was just going to say, because I was thinking of the quality of the relationship, where you might have 2 people. A positive quality relationship would be 2 people who are theoretically perfectly suited to each other. Just because 2 people are perfectly well suited to each other, it doesn't mean they both have positive thoughts, though. One might think, or both might think that they're not suited or whatever.
And just getting back to the bin discussion, David has a very large bin, so it does take a bit longer to take his bin out. So no, and that's everything.
How did David get such a large bin?
I know, I could do with such a big bin. So any top tips, David, on how to get a big bin? We need them.
Okay. Oh, here's the lemon slide.
Yeah, this has caused quite a bit of disruption between Will and I, because I wondered why he's popped a picture of this lemon in. So any suggestions are very welcome. Might pop my mood. So here, the session is completely free of charge as part of our response to COVID-19 and its variants. Thank you for attending and feel free to invite others to future events. We're not sure how many free sessions there will be. It depends on how long COVID lasts and how much interest there is. But again, we've had hundreds here. So love coming. It's literally the highlight of my week. So keep on coming, please. And a certificate of attendance will be emailed to you by the end of the week. And a recording will be also on the website by the end of the week. So if you go to www.apt.ac and then type in free webinars and you'll find the recordings there. Do you know what we're doing next week, Will?
Yes, I do. It's the RAID. It's the RAID approach to. It's a positive approach to working with just about everybody.
Brilliant. Working with people who put lemons in slides. So on that bombshell, see everyone next week.
Lovely. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye.